The recruiting pursuits for Oregon are hot on the trail, and we're looking at a number of quarterbacks, and we've heard Jayden Rashada and we've heard Dante Moore's name, but what if neither commits to Oregon? There's a new recruit in the mix. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view if you're watching on YouTube every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. 5-star views on Apple Podcasts, nice comments or likes on YouTube as well. Appreciate all of that. We welcome back once again our recruiting guru here at the Locked On Podcast Network. He is the director of recruiting for Sports Illustrated. His name is John Garcia Jr. You probably know him by now, Duck fans, or at least you should, because he has been a regular on the guest for, I think it's already been a couple months, hasn't it, John?
It has. You know, they say time flies when you're having fun, so I appreciate you, Spencer.
Well, we are definitely having fun, and Oregon fans are having fun looking at the first full recruiting class of Dan Lanning and company, who have kind of set the bar high with how they salvaged this class of 2022. I've been very pleased with that, and I know a lot of Oregon fans have been excited about it as well, but the big dominoes still yet to fall, as we've been discussing, is that quarterback position. Who's the next big quarterback commit that Oregon is going to get? So before we get into some specific names, because a new guy has emerged as a potential 2023 quarterback commit for the Ducks, do you think that it's possible that, you know, they go after all three of these guys now and they don't get any of them? Like, do you see that as a possibility?
It's possible. I mean, sure, right? I mean, these quarterbacks that Oregon is gunning for are extremely coveted, right? Coast to coast. And a lot of them, particularly Avery Johnson, who I know we'll talk about, have increased their recruiting profile very recently. And we said that about Jayden Rashada, a month ago. Just these guys are national recruits that have elevated where they stand with a lot of schools. So it means a lot of schools want to get them on campus. It means a lot of official visits have been planned and already taken by a lot of these quarterbacks. And when it's a national battle, it really could go either way, especially relative to quarterbacks having different timelines. And all three of these guys are on pretty different wavelengths when it comes to when they want to make a decision. So naturally, the longer you're on the board, the more other schools can get involved, the more new visits can be planned and throw a wrench into things, again, especially when you're a quarterback, because when you're taking an official visit as a QB1 candidate, you're going to get the entire red carpet treatment. And that's everywhere you go, not just Oregon. So you could see why the quarterback dominoes really dominate the national conversation. And for programs like Oregon, involved with many of them, it's going to continue to be the case. And I think that's kind of, I guess, for Dan Lanning and company at Oregon, this is kind of the final frontier. Like you said, 2022 wrapped up beautifully. You have added multiple additions after signing day that should be impact guys. The 23 class is off to a really strong start, particularly on defense and at the skill positions. But the glaring question is, hey, like, what about that quarterback? So until that one is answered, there will be some questions regarding Dan Lanning and that coaching staff's recruiting potential. And they know that, right? And, they come from big-time programs, Lanning and most of these assistants. So they know that it's important to not only stay in the game for elite quarterbacks, but you got to, of course, land one, because second place here really doesn't mean anything. So still going to be fascinating to track going forward. But we do expect June, now that we're here in June, to be that critical point. A lot of these quarterbacks are going to either come off the board altogether or really start to narrow things down, because we're getting close to that time of year where, every top prospect wants to focus on their senior season and sort of have their recruitment behind them. So it's a very important time of year on the recruiting trail, and the Ducks are looking for that class headliner.
Yeah, shake and bake, baby. If you ain't first, you last. So Jayden Rashada and Dante Moore have been the two 5-star quarterback pursuits that Oregon has had for some time now, and we'll get to them. But that third name, I won't tease you anymore, Duck fans. That third name is Avery Johnson, who has suddenly kind of emerged as another potential future signal caller for the Ducks. So instead of a 2-horse race, and going back even to Nico Iamaleava, who ended up flipping at the last minute and going to Tennessee after it looked like the Ducks might get him. It's been Jayden Rashada. It's been Dante Moore. But from what you've told me, Avery Johnson should be squarely in that mix too.
Yeah, he's got an official visit scheduled 2 weekends from now, so right in the middle of June. And that's really where him and his timeline become an incredible focus, because Avery told me most recently, hey, I want to be committed before the Elite 11 finals. The Elite 11 finals start June 28th. So if you're taking a visit June 17th, 18th, and then 10 days later you're going to be in LA representing one school, Oregon's going to get that last visit, most likely, second to last at the absolute worst. So you do feel good about the Ducks' position just relative to others on the official visit timeline. Now, Avery, as we mentioned, is one of these quarterbacks that is ascending. It's like every day he's got a new school talking to him. We hear Notre Dame is very interested. Ohio State is very interested. But among those that have already offered, Washington, Kansas State, Miami are those that are being, considered very highly. He just visited Washington over the weekend, and he actually liked it a lot. Big city feel certainly resonated with him because he's a small town kid from Kansas. So that usually it's the opposite, right? It's these big city kids that visit a college town and really fall in love. But I think in Avery's case, it was a bit of the opposite, going from small town USA to a metro like Seattle, and obviously Washington desperate for a headlining recruit really of any kind in this class of 2023. So they're in this mix now. Kansas State is the home state school, the school he's most familiar with, that a lot of people a month ago thought would really be hard to beat no matter who joined the race. So that still may be true. So that's something to keep an eye on for sure. They're getting their official visit this weekend. And again, he's already the most familiar with Kansas State. So theoretically, if they have a lead and or build on it this coming weekend, the ball goes immediately into Oregon's court because they are the following official visit. So I think the Ducks have a lot in front of them with Avery Johnson, but I think with his skill set, the fit here is kind of classic Oregon. He is a legitimate dual threat. I'm talking 4.5 official, a laser 40-yard dash time, over 1,000 yards as a rusher, as a junior in 2021, threw for 2,500 as a passer as well. And look, he wants to be known as a passer, but that athleticism at 6'2", 6'3", 200 pounds, when you think of Oregon, you just think of quarterbacks that can make plays with their legs, whether it's Justin Herbert, Marcus Mariota, go way back to Dennis Dixon. That's just something we kind of associate with an explosive modern offense. And Oregon's always been at the forefront of that. So when you start talking about scheme fit at Oregon versus a K-State, which is a more conventional run-first offense, versus a Washington, which wants to be a pass-first offense, but we're still obviously waiting to see how that administration rolls out the offense up in Seattle. And then even Miami with Josh Gaddis, that's going to be a more pro-style approach. So when you start to think of the fits on the field for Avery Johnson, you start to almost build an argument for Oregon, and you pair that with the official visit and the timing of when he wants to be verbally committed. And yeah, you have to mention Avery Johnson right up there with Dante Moore, right up there with Jayden Rashada when you talk about Oregon possibilities, because, fit-wise and schematically, you got to like where the Ducks want to be and historically have been with this type of dual threat quarterback.
Yeah, and one of the questions that we all have as Oregon fans going into 2022 is, what is the offense truly going to look like with Kenny Dillingham? And we saw, glimpses of it. We even saw a couple snaps under center, which doesn't happen at Oregon typically. But I think that when you look at what his offensive background is, a mobile quarterback plays into what he wants to do very well. Maybe not running quite as much as Joe Moorhead ran Anthony Brown a season ago, which was, oftentimes Anthony Brown was the second leading rusher in a game because he had 14, 15 carries for 100 yards or so. But I do like that sort of explosive athletic quarterback, because if Dillingham's going to run an RPO approach, you have to have somebody who's mobile. And by the way, you're talking about past Oregon mobile quarterbacks. I think arguably the best, Mariota was the best runner, but I think the second best running quarterback Oregon's ever had was Jeremiah Masoli, because that guy came downhill. He wanted to run people. He ran like a running back when he ran. Darren Thomas, even Dennis Dixon, Herbert, they ran like quarterbacks when they took off to use their legs. Masoli ran like a running back, and that was that was a little bit unique back in the day, but he had quite a good career with Oregon, as I'm sure we all remember. Well, I want to ask you about Jayden Rashada because his brother Roman committed to Ole Miss, but I want to remind all of you that BetOnline is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. You find all the latest developments, news, and odds, including this year's basketball championship matchup, the NHL Hockey Conference Finals, Major League Baseball, go Mariners, and of course, all the latest fighting news from MMA and UFC to boxing. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline is where the game starts. Let's move now to the quarterbacks who we've been talking about here on the show, and we'll start with Jayden Rashada, who I think was the first name that Oregon fans gravitated towards when Nico committed to Tennessee. And I think part of the reason is that he's from the state of California. We've had a lot of success recruiting down there in recent years, and he's also a really good-looking prospect. He's got a fluid motion. He's a good athlete. He's got a big-time arm. He's got good size. But one thing that you and I have been kind of following, maybe on the back burner a little bit, is where his junior college DB brother Roman commits to, because sometimes brothers want to play together, sometimes they don't, but it's happened more than once. And Roman recently committed to Ole Miss, a school that has been in pursuit of Jayden Rashada, but they also have a quarterback commit in the class of 2023. He's a 3-star dual threat quarterback, but where do you think Jayden Rashada is at right now that his brother has decided to go down to old Hotty Toddy?
That question, where do you think Jayden Rashada is at? That alone in any context has been fascinating, because even if you're talking physically, just in the last few days, he was at Ole Miss with his big brother, Roman, right when he committed. Roman was taking a midweek official last week, and then he went straight to College Station for his first visit at Texas A&M, which has been kind of the new trending program surrounding Jayden Rashada's name. So that was over the weekend. He kicked off this week, I believe, at LSU for another visit there, and now he's at Florida as we speak. So where Jayden Rashada is at physically has become kind of hard to put into context.
Where's Waldo?
So as you can tell, as you can tell, a lot of schools still want this kid, and he's still undecided. He's still trying to figure out exactly where he wants to be. But the clock is really ticking here, because we talked about Johnson wanting to commit sometime before June 28th. 10 days before that, Rashada comes off the board, period. June 18th, his dad's birthday. That's been his date for quite some time. Of those top 7 schools that he dropped, he'd been to all of them but Texas A&M. So now that box is checked. So we think he's kind of in full evaluation mode at this point. Again, the Gators do have him on campus right now. It's his second trip to Gainesville in like 2.5 weeks. So there is some buzz coming from Gainesville. They've kind of zeroed in on him as their top target, even though they were maybe getting a visit from Arch Manning. They were in it for Eli Holstein, who's now committed to Alabama. So really, Rashada's all they have left on that front. So you understand the urgency for the Gators to be all in on Jayden. But that can be said for Oregon and LSU and every other school not named Ole Miss in this conversation. And that's where it gets interesting, right? Because he was back there in Oxford with Big Bro when he committed his 4th trip to Oxford. I mean, how many California prospects make 4 visits to Ole Miss? It just doesn't happen a lot. There's obviously a rapport between him and Lane Kiffin. Kiffin is known for that quarterback development, so you understand that angle. But like you said, Marcel Reed is committed to Ole Miss at quarterback. And at the time, I was told by a source close to the program that they were kind of done. They were like, hey, we love Jayden Rashada. He wasn't ready to jump in when he took that official in April. Marcel Reed was. So you take Reed, kind of the safer bet. And you can understand it from the Ole Miss perspective, right? The biggest name in high school football, Arch Manning, is an Ole Miss legacy who this year really kind of moved on from the Rebels. So you could understand them wanting to secure that quarterback spot in the class of 2023. So as of late April, they weren't really sure about Rashada, and they weren't really sure about taking 2 quarterbacks. Now they do appear more poised to potentially take a second quarterback, but it's just hard to gauge where Jayden feels about that, right? Relative to all the other 6 schools on his list looking for their first quarterback. So I do think that hurts Ole Miss, even though, like you said, his brother is now committed there. It's the only possibility if they want to play together again. That's something that Roman talks about more than Jayden, as far as I can and dig up. I've talked to each individually, and Roman brought up his little brother. Jayden, kind of saluted his big brother, but I think he's more open. And look, he's got more options, right? He's got more national options, so he's more open to kind of blazing his own trail. And his brother's a junior college signee who's going to be able to play sooner rather than later, and he has less eligibility. So really, they would only play together a couple years if it were to be Ole Miss for Jayden. And who knows, relative to the quarterback room there and when he may be the guy, they may not really overlap as on-field contributors at that same time. So I do think the package deal element of these brothers is a little bit overblown, I would say. I was trying to put it nicely, but overblown is all I could think of. So I do think that Jayden's probably going to end up elsewhere. I think going into these SEC visits, it was very much an Oregon Ole Miss feel. But since he's begun taking the trips, I think Florida and Texas A&M have now risen to that point. So I view it as a three-team race most specifically. I think Oregon, Florida, and Texas A&M are in the best position right now for Rashada. But again, still taking visits, still unsure 100% on where that verbal commitment is going to be. So going to be fascinating, and he'll be the first domino of these three names to drop. So I think that will obviously tell a ton about what Oregon is doing. And I think that's a good thing, because if all three of these quarterbacks were waiting till September or October to make a decision, you could understand the stress it would create for Dan Lanning and company, because you don't know, and then all at once, boom, all three make a decision. Here, you'll know where you stand for Rashada. If he goes elsewhere, you can focus more on Johnson, who's the next guy to commit. If he goes elsewhere, Dante Moore looks like he's taking his time, so you can be 1,000% all in on him, kind of to round things out. So the calendar does help Oregon, but it also places an urgency on trying to figure out exactly where you stand, because you don't want to be, in recruiting they say caught with your pants down. You don't want to be left in the dark, I should say, about where these quarterbacks are heading. So you just wonder how Kenny Dillingham, Dan Lanning, and company are communicating with all three, trying to figure out where do we stand versus where are we hearing from other sources, other programs. Going to be fascinating, because all three of these guys, again, they've got 4, 5, 6 schools trying to get visits, trying to get them on the commitment list. So we'll see.
One other thing to factor in with regards to Jayden maybe going to Ole Miss is that they've got Jackson Dart, who they got from USC in the portal, who was with the Trojans for 1 year. So, depending on how his NFL draft stock rises, he's going to be the starter at least for 2 more years, maybe 3, but at least 2. And I think that has to factor into his calculation as well, is like, what sort of quarterback situation am I coming into? At Ole Miss, it's competitive at Texas A&M as well, but Jackson Dart is going to be the starter. I bet you he'll put up a zillion yards this year with Lane Kiffin as his play caller, because that's just what Lane Kiffin tends to do in college football. I think there are a lot of similarities with Dart and Matt Corral. I think Dart might actually be a little bit better. I like a lot what I saw from him when he was at USC, whereas you look at a situation like Oregon, if Bo Nix is the starter this year, but for only 1 more year, if either Ty Thompson or Jay Butterfield were to leave the program, I think you might have a better shot of competing for a slot early there. What about the Midwest kid, the other Midwest quarterback kid that Oregon is looking at, or I guess I should say the first one? I think Avery Johnson is now sort of the other one, so to speak, because Dante Moore was first, but Notre Dame has been the leading candidate for Moore for quite some time. Where is that recruitment at, and is there a timeline on him?
That's what's so fascinating, Spencer. There really isn't. Dante Moore and Arch Manning are the only 2 quarterbacks left on the board that are kind of, hey, we'll take our time, we'll take our visits, and we maybe want to see how some of these coaches do and these programs do, particularly these first-year programs. And just like with Manning and even Jayden Rashada, I mean, Dante's looking at schools that have had a lot of coaching turnover. Texas A&M, LSU, Oregon, certainly all under, relatively recent administrations. A&M, going to go through a quarterback change here in 2022. So he's curious to see how that looks. Notre Dame had a head coaching change. So there's a lot of, hey, I want to see how everybody looks come September. So if that's the case, this long-standing Notre Dame buzz you can't feel great about it as more time goes on. Now, if Dante had one of these commitment dates like Jayden or Avery Johnson, where you're like, hey, he's coming off the board in a few days, you probably feel good from the Notre Dame perspective. But as more programs get in the mix and as more visits are taken, you have to start to pull back on that just from a classic recruiting perspective. And Dante has taken, from the quarterback position, probably the most visits in the country among these elite quarterbacks that we talk about. It includes 2 trips to Oregon. Big fan of Kenny Dillingham. He's a big fan of Dan Lanning. He likes the youth on the staff. He certainly likes some of the pedigree that these coaches are pulling from, having been at big-time programs, winning some big-time, high-profile games. So that's something that certainly resonates with him. And I think Dante, maybe even more than Rashada and Avery Johnson, is absolutely glued into the quarterback situations at some of these schools. And I think that's why some of these transition coaching staffs really has his attention. Miami's another one that he's high on at this time because there's a lot of uncertainty, right? Not only how are they going to look on the field, how is the depth of that quarterback room going to look? And as you pointed out for Oregon, pretty favorable, right? Because you want to get on the field year 1, year 2 at the latest if you're an elite quarterback like a Dante Moore. And at certain programs, that path is a little bit clearer. So that will be interesting to see when he does start to watch these games in the fall, take more visits, and begin to narrow his list a little bit further. But right now, there's only one visit left scheduled for Dante. It's Texas A&M. Ironically, the same day Jayden Rashada is going to commit, June 18th, Dante Moore will be in College Station. So you can kind of read into that one of two ways. You could either say, well, A&M doesn't feel great about Rashada because Moore is going to visit that same day, or you can read into it as, Texas A&M is just kind of building insurance in case they don't get Rashada, because obviously you're not going to say no to a Dante Moore visit anyway. So that's kind of an interesting irony between the two. We've talked about the same schools with a lot of them: Oregon, LSU, Texas A&M, Miami in particular. All 4 of those involved for both Rashada and Dante Moore. So really the question around him has become, what about Notre Dame? And what about these visits? Could anything else develop beyond this Texas A&M trip in a couple of weeks? And right now, it kind of looks like it will not. There's a big 7-on-7 in Vegas this weekend that Dante will be throwing at. Rashada will be throwing there too. So that kind of eliminates the weekend trips for those guys right now. So Michigan was recent for Dante, and A&M's coming up 2 weekends from now, and that's kind of it. So that leaves optimism for a lot of the programs still in the mix. Again, Oregon's one of the few that have gotten multiple visits out of Dante, including an official. And again, that really elevated the profile of Oregon in his eyes. So I think when you start to try to peg, okay, what's the most likely thing for Oregon? I think location-wise and contender-wise, you feel good about Rashada, but you're curious about these SEC trips because they're still TBD on some of those opinions. And then probably Johnson, I would say, because of that schematic fit, because of what he brings to the table relative to the others and his timeline and the visit right ahead of that commitment date, I do think serves UO well there. And then with Moore, it's just everybody's got their hands up. Everybody's just like, call 3 different days, you're going to get 3 different answers. So that's what makes it fascinating, relative to his decision. But again, there is good news for Oregon coming in some respect in terms of clarity. You're going to know the deal with Rashada in 10 days. You're going to know the deal with Johnson right after that. And then if you strike out on those 2, all hands on deck, the whole, staff, recruiting staff, support staff, hosts, everybody will be all in on Dante Moore, even though they're pretty much in that ballpark right now because he is a priority quarterback nationally. So as you can tell, there's a lot of varying thoughts around all 3 of these guys. But again, Oregon truly involved with all 3, and they'll get some clarity here soon.
Is that that 7-on-7 thing in Vegas where Rashada's throwing at? Is that like an open event or is that closed? Or like what's the availability? I live 2.5 hours from Vegas, is why I'm asking. I want to go down and watch.
Yeah, I'll be there the first couple of days, so let me know. It's the Overtime and Cam Newton event. So Overtime is known for social media videos, primarily basketball focused, but they're broadening their horizon, and this is the first OT7 7-on-7. It's actually 4 days in Las Vegas Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And Jayden Rashada is playing with the Miami Immortals. So if you want to read into that, you can. So he's playing with a couple Miami commitments, and obviously guys from South Florida. So you might want to read into that or not. But they've got great receiver targets, and he probably just wants to win as well. So not a bad group of skill position players to pick from. But yeah, he's throwing out there. Dante Moore's throwing out there. I think Dante's playing for Cam Newton's program. So naturally, he also will be surrounded by athletes in SEC and ACC country. So again, read into that if you'd like. But both of these guys have played with multiple 7-on-7 teams at different points. It's just the nature of being a top 5 type quarterback nationally. Everybody wants you to play for them, and who's going to pass up a free trip to Las Vegas? I certainly wouldn't have at 17 years old.
Yeah, it's a little more fun once you turn 21, but it's not a bad time when you're under that age as well. Let's wrap up real quick here with John Garcia, the Sports Illustrated Director of Recruiting, and switch to the defensive side of the ball. One name that will be familiar to Duck fans on the recruiting trail, and a new name as well. But let's start with Jayden Wayne, the 5-star edge player, 6'4", 6'5", about 250, 240, 250 or so out of the Tacoma area. He's been on the Ducks radar for a while. He continues to make the final cuts. What's kind of the latest on him?
Well, he finally dropped some top schools, like officially, right? We had been talking about some of the schools like, hey, we know, for instance, Alabama or LSU was going to stay in that mix in SEC country. The question when he dropped the top schools was always about the Pac-12, because we knew it would be a small number of Pac-12 schools, and really 3 had been involved with him the most. Of course, the in-state Washington Huskies, USC, and Oregon, which always recruit Seattle very well, especially when there's a high-profile prospect. So lo and behold, he drops his top 6, and there's only one Pac-12 program, and it's the Oregon Ducks. So another Seattle or in-state recruit that Washington will miss out on. But the surprise is USC, right? You just kind of expect them to stay in the mix for all these elite prospects. But I do think it kind of tells you where this kid's head is at, right? He's looking heavily at SEC country. And then there's Oregon as the Pac-12 outlier. And look, as this summer is progressing, we're seeing that a lot. There's only 1 or 2 schools out west that are competing with the SEC programs, with Ohio State and Clemson for these big-time defensive recruits in particular. And it's kind of been Oregon. They have been that program that has stayed in the hunt, especially with the defensive recruits, which is, again, we've talked about this kind of grouping that Oregon has under Dan Lanning, with Lanning and Lupoy and some of these coaches that have such a great resume. That stuff is really resonating on the recruiting trail. And Oregon is kind of this outlier for a lot of big-time defensive prospects, but they're still in the game, right? Wayne in particular is taking a bunch of visits. He was at Michigan State last weekend. He's got a bunch more planned for the month of June, but he's incredibly familiar with Oregon. He's visited, I think, 3+ times already. So you wonder if he'll get back for one more trip. But look, they've stayed in the mix here for a reason. And they're really the only, kind of like we talked about with Rashada, if he's going to stay out west, it's going to be with the Oregon Ducks. And that's really not only the longstanding mark of the Oregon brand, but that's the exact tier of recruiting you want to be at Oregon, whether you're a first-year coach like Dan Lanning or a tenured coach. You've got to be that flashy brand name school out west that can compete for kids locally and nationally all the same. And I think wherever Wayne ends up, that will be one of the bigger stories of this 2023 recruiting cycle. But again, if he stays out west, he'll be a Duck.
Finally, a new name that has popped up on the Oregon recruiting radar in the class of 2023 is not what I would describe as a position of need right now when you look at the Ducks roster in the recent recruiting classes, but it's a linebacker, 4-star guy by the name of Samaj Bridgeman. And I say it's not a huge need. Doesn't mean I don't want to see Oregon get good players at any position, even if we're already loaded at that particular slot. But, Justin Flo will be back next season. You've got Harrison Taggart on the roster. You've got Keith Brown on the roster. Devin Jackson, who might be the best of all the young linebackers other than Justin Flo and Noah Sewell right now. I think kind of that next wave, I think he's got the physical attributes to be the best of the bunch. But Bridgeman, a guy who's suddenly popping up on the radar, and how come that's the case for the Ducks? Good news, of course.
Yeah, again, it's like all these regional schools for this kid, and then Oregon, in his top 6. He's a Northeastern kid, so naturally, you got Big Ten represented. The SEC schools have been high on him. I think he was at Georgia 2 weekends ago. And obviously they're the national champs, and we know what they've done defensively, so they're heavily involved here. And then there's Oregon. This is kind of the opposite of Wayne's recruitment, where locally, it's only the Ducks, and he's visited a bunch, and it's just a matter of staying in the race. Total opposite here for Samaj, where it's like he's visited all these other programs, never been out to Oregon. He's maybe setting it up, but the timing here is okay because Samaj is in no rush to make a verbal commitment. I think he's going to take a couple officials in June and then take the rest in the fall. So kind of want to line up, official visits with big games. We know Oregon has many of those. So he wants to reciprocate that interest that the Ducks have shown. And that's really one of the things that he said, really stood out about that Duck angle. He told Brian Doan of 24/7 Sports, my old colleague, he said, look, they came out to see me and scout me and have really dug into staying consistent in recruiting me, even though I haven't been out there. I've been staying local. I'm being courted by these SEC schools and Big Ten schools, yet Oregon has some staying power because of just their approach, really. So he thought that was a big deal and showed that he was a priority to the Ducks. And I do think it will eventually lead to an official visit, and that love will be reciprocated, at least in the opportunity to host him for a visit. So obviously you need to get to that point to figure out if you're really in the game, from the Oregon perspective. But again, only a few visits coming up, no rush to make a verbal commitment. So you feel good about the chances if and when you do get that official visit, because look, kids love taking officials, and Oregon's one of those programs that you're not going to hear a lot of bad comments about when kids do actually get on campus. So the longer his recruitment goes, probably the better news for the Ducks, especially if he schedules that visit. But you're in the top 6. You're the outlier, just like you are with Jayden Wayne and so many other defensive recruits. And that's where you need to be at this point if you're the Oregon Ducks. So good news pretty much across the board, but obviously we're going to find out a lot about these kids when the month of June, progresses and eventually wraps up on both sides of the ball.
Nobody is ever as locked and loaded with recruiting information as John Garcia Jr., the director of recruiting for Sports Illustrated. Always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks, John.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
I appreciate you making this your first listen. Go make Locked On Pac-12, where I'm hosting Talking About the Conference of Champions, your second listen or view on YouTube of the day. I appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.